Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today on choosing a cloud provider. My name is Gary Jacobs, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. A cloud service provider can make or break your healthcare practice, so it's important that you take time when choosing one. Today, we'll learn what a cloud service provider does and what are the top 3 things to keep in mind when selecting a cloud hosting partner. Most importantly, we'll walk through the actions that we recommend you take to minimize threats to your organization. Healthcare organizations remain a top target of cyber criminals. We want to help you make the best IT security decisions for your organization so that you can continue to deliver the best patient care. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. We plan to leave some time at the end of the presentation for a short Q&A with our presenter. All of our guests will be left on mute throughout the presentation, but as you're listening to the presentation, please type any questions you might have into the chat window on your screen where you see the phrase "type message here." We have a large group in attendance and we'll be able to address some of your questions live today as time permits. Today's presentation will be recorded, so we'll be able to follow up with you after the presentation to address your specific questions. And everyone will receive a link to the recording of today's presentation. And with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter. Chris Gooch is MedTech Solutions Director of Engineering and oversees our cloud operation. Chris has nearly 20 years of experience in the IT industry, including a dozen plus years specifically focused on healthcare information technology. Today, Chris will discuss various cloud technologies and services and will address cloud security, reliability, and performance. Good afternoon, Chris.
Hi, good afternoon, Gary, and good afternoon or good morning to everybody listening in from wherever you're from. Hopefully you're having a great day. And as Gary said, I'm excited to kind of share with all of you today the top 3 considerations of choosing a cloud provider. So let's go ahead and get started. So the learning objectives or topics that we're going to go over today is what does it mean when we talk about the cloud? And in specific, what is cloud computing? So we're going to go over that first. And then second, we're going to go over what the benefits of the cloud are. And then third, we're going to go over the 3 considerations of when to select a cloud provider or how to select a cloud provider. And then lastly, we're going to follow up for when you're ready to move to the cloud, then what's your next steps? So first, let's talk about what the cloud is. So the technical definition of cloud computing in general is cloud computing is the on-demand delivery of IT resources over the internet. So what does that exactly mean? So the old IT humor joke is the cloud is just someone else's computer. Well, that's partially true. It's much bigger than that. It gives organizations and businesses and practices way more capability in being able to provide services to their customers or end users, and allows their teams to focus on other things within the business. So we're going to go over some of the benefits of that in a little bit later. But first, I want to kind of introduce to you some of the different cloud models. So there's 3 different cloud models. There's the private cloud, public cloud, and then hybrid cloud. So in a private cloud situation, you have facilities that are private that are holding your server infrastructures that your end users are connecting into. This could be a co-location facility. This could be a private cloud data center from a cloud provider. It could be several other different methods. One of the biggest advantages of the private cloud is that it provides flexibility. It allows you to be able to customize your resources so that you can be pretty much build the fit what your organization needs. It still also gives IT representatives within your company more control of the environment. IT staff are used to having servers on premise. They're used to having that control, still having access to everything that they need to do. The private cloud allows you to have that flexibility with your IT staff, so they still feel like they're in control of the IT environment of your organization. And lastly, the other bigger advantage of it is that it's more scalable, and it's more scalable than on-premise, right? So private cloud providers are the ones that are responsible to maintain the hardware, maintain enough hardware to fit the needs of its hosting customers, right? So for on-premise infrastructure, you have to go through a procurement process. You have to purchase hardware, wait for it to be delivered, install it, etc. So with a private cloud provider or any cloud provider, they're responsible for that. So when you need the resources, they're there and available for you, and you don't have a long lead time compared to what it would be on-prem. Now moving on to public cloud. So public cloud, most people, when they refer to that, it's going to be either Microsoft Azure, AWS, Google Cloud Platform, those big service providers that are out there. The largest advantage of those is the flexible pricing model. So what does that mean? So flexible pricing means that you're basically paying for what you use in those environments. So if you have a server that's powered on, you're only getting charged for the time that it's powered on. If you want to shut that server down on the weekends because you don't need it, then you don't get charged for that while that's powered down over that Saturday and Sunday. So there's a lot of flexibility in pricing with the public cloud. And then as far as the scalability goes, those huge cloud providers have near unlimited scalability. So again, if you need to provision a server at a minute's notice, you can do that within minutes in the public cloud. And then you can pretty much size the system however large you really want. And no matter how large you size it, you'll have it at the same exact amount of time. So that's really where the economies of scale comes in for the public cloud environment. So that's a huge advantage. Also for the public cloud, having the high reliability. So with the public cloud, you're able to span resources across multiple zones within a region. You can actually do it across multiple regions within a country, and you can even do it globally. So I could have servers sitting in Iowa, US, for example, in the central region, and then I can also have servers in Europe if I needed to. So there's a huge amount of reliability and scalability that can be had in the public cloud, depending on what your business needs. For the hybrid now, the hybrid is kind of a combination of both, right? Both private and public. And it kind of gives you the aspects of both depending on your workloads. So again, you have the flexibility. So you might have some workloads in private cloud where you still have a lot of control, but then you might need to use public cloud for certain resources where it's been better to run those in the public cloud. Like database services, things like that, for example, might be cheaper and easier to run in the public cloud, but you still need to maintain, IIS front-end servers that need to live in a private cloud because you need to have more control over those. So it really just depends on the amount of workload and type of workload that you have, where that will, a hybrid might benefit. And again, the cost effectiveness, for certain workloads, it might be beneficial from a cost perspective to have a hybrid configuration where you have some in private and some in public. And again, the ease of the cloud or having both clouds is a good advantage. So now we're going to move on and kind of talk about the benefits of the cloud. So there's many benefits to the cloud, way more than what would take me, hours probably to go through all the benefits, but I want to focus particularly on 4. So I chose cost, agility, security, and availability to kind of dive into. And I feel that those are, out of all the ones that are there, these are the most important to kind of relate to you guys today. So first, let's go over the cost reduction. So the cloud costs less than running on-prem. It basically eliminates all your heavy upfront costs. So again, when you're running on-premise infrastructure, you have to procure the hardware, you have to purchase it against a capital budget and implement it. And every 3 to 5, 6 years, you're going to have to replace that hardware again. So you have to develop that budget and that planning process when you're doing stuff on premise. In the cloud, it shifts everything to an operating expense. So, so from an accounting perspective, there's a lot of benefits in that as well, because you'll have more consistent budgeting as you go through the years as you're using public cloud. And again, you don't have to worry about having to replace hardware, in 5 years, have to try to figure out, to come up with the money to replace stuff and things like that. So the cloud service in general eliminates the need for all of that. And again, like I mentioned earlier, the economies of scale. So with any of the cloud providers, again, you have resources at your fingertips that you can spin up at a minute's notice. For on-premise, you have a certain capacity, and once you reach that capacity, even if it's in the middle of the year of that budget year, then you're having to go back to your team and asking for more hardware and increasing the resources that you need that's on-prem. So again, that could be another considerable amount of expense that maybe wasn't even planned for. But with the cloud, the public cloud or any cloud service, you can expand those services relatively cheaper than what you can with that upfront capital cost. And then the most important thing that I add in here is the people cost, right? So it allows IT professionals that work for your business to focus on other business operations. And what I mean by that is when you work with a cloud service provider, they usually provide some of the services for you that allows your IT team to focus on other things. So all of the mundane patching, all the underlying infrastructure firmware upgrades, all those types of things, all of those things are typically done by a cloud service provider that if you had that on-prem, your IT department is responsible for. So the excellent thing about working with a cloud service provider is they do all that for you. So your IT team doesn't necessarily get replaced. They get just be able to get refocused to go to other areas, and maybe to actually work on projects that haven't been completed yet because they just haven't had time to do it. So that's where the benefit of cloud services can really come in for your IT department. Next, for the agility. So the cloud, again, allows organizations to quickly respond to opportunities and problems. And what I mean by that is say that your business is rapidly growing, or you're doing acquisitions or anything of that nature. Again, your resources in your cloud infrastructure might need to grow, or it might need to shrink depending on the situation as well. So the cloud allows you to be able to, again, at a minute's notice, be able to expand those resources or even decrease the resources if your demand drops. The other thing is for problems around performance. So let's say that you perform a software upgrade on your main business application, and you might need additional resources added to that environment to increase the performance of it, let's say. Again, with on-premise, you might be limited on the amount of capacity that you have to add to the system. And again, you might have to go back to the accounting team and say, hey, I need more money to add more CPU or add more memory, add more drives for storage, etc. But the cloud, you could just immediately change it to where you have more CPU, more memory, all that, all at a click's notice. So again, that the public cloud allows you to have almost unlimited scalability in that regard. And lastly, on the agility is taking advantage of automation. So again, between working with a cloud provider and working with all the automation technologies that are out there today in cloud services, allowing your IT team to get away from all those things and being able to focus on the business. So that's a huge advantage. And lastly, we'll talk about security next. So security is a big topic for public cloud. Public cloud kind of over the years of, especially when it first got started, had a bad rap for, oh, I don't want my stuff in public cloud. It's not safe. I could see it in my data center. I could touch it. The public cloud just scares me too much. And in reality, that's really not true. even though you can't physically touch the hardware and things of that nature, the security tools that the public cloud or any cloud service provider can provide is pretty unmatched compared to what you can get on premise. And again, you benefit from the economies of scale of that as well. For all the amount of security tools that you would have to spend money on and implement on premise, a lot of times it's going to be way cost prohibitive for organizations to do that. So when you're in a cloud service, a lot of those tools and things like that are a lot less expensive, and they're easy to implement. So from that perspective alone, you're able to get options that you may not have. For example, DDoS protection. Most organizations with their on-premise infrastructures, they might not have DDoS protection, or might not have it rather. With cloud service providers, you almost have that by default. Now, there's obviously different levels of it, but usually the cloud provider will provide at least a standard of DDoS protection. And again, most organizations on premise don't even have that capability. There's a lot of other resources such as intrusion detection, more advanced endpoint protections, things of that nature. Again, not that you can't do that on premise, but all those things are native in cloud and they're easy to implement. I mean, a lot of these tools are just a simple click of a button, and they automatically deploy within your environment. So it's definitely a lot different experience and management of it in the public cloud. And then lastly, on the security is taking advantage of the compliance, right? So again, all your major cloud providers, for the most part, are going to have some level of certifications, whether depending on what industry you're in, it might be for PCI compliance, HITRUST for healthcare, HIPAA for healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of those cloud providers will have a compliance and certifications in these areas where, again, it might be pretty tough for an organization to do that. For example, the HITRUST certification is a very extensive, grueling audit process, and for an IT organization to do that within a private scope might be pretty tough, because it almost takes a full-time job for someone to manage that on a yearly basis. So again, cloud service providers provide those services almost by default. And again, that's kind of one of the points of the message today, right? Is looking for a cloud provider that has those services. So again, those are big advantages for people moving to the cloud. And then lastly, let's talk about the availability. So the reason why I chose the availability is because a lot of people with on-premise infrastructures, they come to us and say, hey, I just had a hurricane, for example, come through, and we were down for days, but offices that were in different states that weren't affected by the disaster, they were down as well because our data center was down. So that's with all the natural disasters that are happening today, that's probably a big number one thing that we get in that regard. So the public cloud allows you to have superior redundancy. It allows the redundancy within the infrastructures itself is very highly available. Between the server infrastructure, the switching, the internet connectivity, all those things into a public cloud service provider are top notch. And again, a lot of those things are maybe unattainable from a private organization running their infrastructure on premise. So that's really important. For the public clouds in specific, they have different fault domains within the same physical data center. So if something fails within a certain row or a certain cabinet, then they have the ability to fail over to another row or a different cabinet or even on a different floor of the same physical building. And then they also have redundancies for zones, which means different data centers within the same area, right? So, and then also, like I mentioned earlier, the different regions. You're able to primarily host out of the central U.S. region, but then your DR region might be the west or east U.S. So again, if you have a data center issue or a natural disaster that affects a certain area, and that's where your primary hosting is, then it's very easy to migrate and to set up the environment in a different region. And then again, the backup and recovery, or backup and replication rather, it's pretty unmatched. Again, you're able to back up your data for pennies on the dollar, pretty much, with storage, and then you're able to replicate that data anywhere in the world if you choose, to be able to recover from. So next, let's go into the actual 3 considerations of selecting a cloud provider. So the first one I'm going to go over is the reliability and performance. Second is going to be security, and third is going to be the technology and services that cloud provider provides. So let's talk about reliability and performance. So, downtime is inevitable. It's going to happen. No matter how big you are, how small you are, the cloud provider is always going to have some sort of downtime one way or another. Even the Microsoft Azures and AWSs have downtime within a particular data center. I know of 2 or 3 or 4 outages from AWS in the last several years. So downtime is going to have to be accepted. But the point that I wanted to bring up though is how your service provider actually handles the downtime, right? So that's what's important. Is your provider prepared? Do they have the things in place that you need as a business to be able to continue functioning if if a data center goes down? So again, the public cloud and service cloud provider will have those solutions in place. One thing I point out here is the RPOs and RTOs. So it's important, in my opinion, to have a discussion, an open discussion with your service cloud provider about what the RPO and RTOs are for your cloud hosting environment. So whether you're already in a cloud hosting agreement or you're looking to move to the cloud and you're looking for those talking to those providers rather, have that conversation with them and know what you want. Understand what your organization wants and what your organization can minimally have, right? So those could be 2 different things. You may want to have no downtime at all, and you might want to have, no data loss at all. And then, you might be acceptable to have, 24 hours of data loss, but then, I can resume my business back within 8 hours, So I'm willing to accept that, but, what I really, really want is, no downtime at all. Well, the difference between those 2 is very drastic. The amount of technology that is needed to get the near zero RPO, RTO is a lot more expensive typically than, the acceptable, I could be down for 8 hours and I could deal with 24 hours of data loss. So, the difference between those 2 solutions usually from a cost perspective is pretty drastic. So you have to go in and have your conversation with your cloud provider, not only of what they provide by default to your, what's quote unquote standard to your hosting agreement, but you also need to reach out and say, hey, just curious, if I wanted to have a 0 RPO, RTO, what does that look like? And how much is it? And they might come back and, you might not be able to afford that. And you might have to, depending on your business needs. So have those conversations up front. Or if you're, like I said, if you're in a current hosting agreement, have those conversations with your cloud provider, because, that's important in understanding and making decisions for downtime. And then another important part as far as cloud service providers is application awareness. So do they understand your applications? If you're in the healthcare industry, are they a healthcare specific cloud provider? And do they know your applications? Or if you're running NextGen or Epic or any of those other EHR systems, do they understand and know the back end workings of those applications? And this kind of ties more into the performance aspect, right? So if those service providers that are helping manage and building and architecting your infrastructure, if they don't understand how a lot of those applications work or the interoperabilities of those applications work, then you could find yourself in a situation where you're not having the best performance, maybe even from a support perspective, which we'll get into a little bit later, is not the best. So having a cloud provider that understands your applications is definitely key in my opinion. Everybody has a SQL, a SQL database administrator on staff, usually for a cloud service provider. But does that SQL person really know everything within the actual database itself of your application? There's a big difference in some cases there. So having that application awareness is key. Next, I went over the security. So in today's world, cybersecurity should be on the top of everybody's mind, especially, regardless if it's on-prem or in the cloud. Security should always be the number one thing that's out there. The threats that we face today are pretty extreme, and it's getting tougher and tougher every day to go against. So it definitely is worth having a conversation and selecting a cloud provider that is security minded and security focused. So when you go into a cloud hosting agreement, or like I said, if you're already in one, ask what security services are provided and what are offered. And there's a difference there, right? So again, some cloud service providers may give you certain security options by default, and some of them you might have to add on, and there are additional fees. So ask your cloud provider, what the difference is there and what they have to offer. How do they treat cybersecurity threats? What do they do for prevention? What do they do to detect a security threat? And then how would they mitigate it? And I'm going to focus more on the mitigation side for now, but this is a huge topic within itself. The cloud provider, if they can work with you to, make sure that your backups are in good order, make sure you can recover from a ransomware event, work with your cyber insurance and company, or even perhaps have a CSIRT team to do forensics and to figure out how they got in and how to, prevent them from sending out your data any more than maybe they already have. So all of those are different things to look at, and how your cloud service provider handles those things is really key, because time is really of an essence during an attack, and how your organization handles that is definitely a key thing. And then again, looking at your compliance and certifications. Does your cloud service provider or management service have certifications such as HITRUST, SOC, and all those different things? And the reason why I bring this up is a huge advantage is that if you have an organization that is HITRUST certified, for example, that they have very strict policies and procedures that they're following to keep your environment safe. And more importantly, they're training their staff. The support staff and the IT staff that's managing your environment are also getting trained and updated on this information on a yearly basis. So again, I think that's a huge advantage of working with a cloud service provider in that regard. And lastly, the technologies and services that cloud service provider brings to the table, I think is a huge advantage. I think this topic here can really make or break a service provider relationship with a customer. The first thing you would want to ask or look at is how do they architect your infrastructure? Again, having that application awareness and your understanding of your industry or your business is a big key in that. Because anybody can throw a server out there and put an application on it, but is it really set up and architected in a way that's going to be best for performance and for the reliability that your end users need? And along with that too, and the statement I put here is, making sure that they're providing you the best but stable. So what I mean by that is, we're looking at infrastructure, asking the service provider, how old is your infrastructure? How often do you refresh your infrastructure? Because they're from a performance perspective, that could be a huge thing, right? If they have older hardware, you're using older memory, you're using older CPUs, and you might not be getting the performance out of it that you could with all the newer technologies out there. So I think that's really important. The stable piece that I mentioned in this comment is, you want your technology service company to be not necessarily bleeding edge, but cutting edge, right? So what do I mean by that is, we don't want IT providers to go out and download a beta version of firmware and put that out everywhere, and then we have all kinds of instability within the network because that software wasn't vetted. So, we don't necessarily want the latest and greatest, but we want to make sure that A, we stay in compliance, and B, we want to make sure that we're picking a solution that we know is going to be stable, 99% of the time. So that's what I mean by that. So I think that's a big conversation to have with your cloud service provider on what kind of technologies they have, how often they refresh, and how they handle patching and infrastructure items such as that. Another big advantage, I think, for a cloud service provider is their migration services. So when you're looking to move to the cloud or move to a different cloud, perhaps, discuss those options with those providers and see what they have. There's a lot of different ways and mechanisms to go out and transfer your data from your private cloud or private, on-premise data center to the cloud. Again, there's a lot more topics to go into that. However, those migration services are going to depend on how smooth your transition is to the cloud. So it's important to really discuss the options and understand how that service provider is going to get you to the cloud and with the least resistance as possible. One good example I mentioned to that is Active Directory. So are they going to allow you to extend your current Active Directory into that cloud, or do you have to build a whole new Active Directory or do a trust? Some providers will, do one way or the other. And more and more we're seeing today that, with the SSO capabilities and all the integrations with the public cloud services, extending your Active Directory from on-premise into the cloud is a big thing. And some providers will flat out not do that. So there's definitely some conversations to have around that whole process when you're looking to go to the cloud. And then lastly, I think the most important, in my opinion, is the support services that that cloud provider provides, right? Not only during the migration to your cloud, but after you've went to the cloud, what does that support after or post-migration look like? Again, having the application awareness and knowing how your business functions, knowing the industry is a big part in that. And also having a discussion with your provider on how you transition from deployment or moving to the cloud to post support. And I think that's a big thing to go over, because eventually, 9 times out of 10, you're going to have a different team that's onboarding you into the cloud or migrating you to the cloud versus another team that's going to be supporting you after you move. So making sure that those organizations are talking to each other during your migration, making sure that both teams know your infrastructure and know how it's being built and understand your applications, ultimately provides you a better service after you've moved to the cloud. So definitely have that conversation with your service provider. So, and lastly, if you're not in the cloud today, you're maybe looking at it, and hopefully I've maybe convinced you with some of the advantages and benefits to the cloud. Are you ready to move? So if you make that decision, what are some next steps? So I would suggest that, if you're ready to move to the cloud, have whatever, and you've maybe selected a provider, let's go with that too. Speak with that provider and ask them to perform an assessment of your current environment, okay? Have them review everything that you have that you want to move to the cloud. And again, there might be a difference. There might be things that you want on premise still, and there might be stuff that you want to the cloud. So be clear and define what your migration to the cloud actually looks like. And if it's everything, it's everything. It really just depends. So that's up to your team and your decision to make. But have them perform an assessment. And the other topic on that is, point out any trouble areas or performance issues that you're currently having today in your environment. Again, whether you're on premise or in another cloud environment, if you're having performance issues, let your cloud provider know that before the migration actually starts. And even preferably even before the quoting process has even happened, because they might do an assessment on your environment and say, oh yeah, your database server needs a lot more resources than what is currently allocated. And that could affect your cloud hosting costs as well when you're going through that decision making process. So pointing out those areas, and again, I mean, it might even just be an architectural change that needs to happen. But if you point those things out to the cloud provider during that process, they could better architect the environment and hopefully mitigate some of those things. So then that way your end users have a better experience when they move to the cloud. And that also gives a lot of the upper management executive teams a good feeling too, right? We want to move to the cloud, and all of a sudden I get all kinds of calls from clients saying, oh my gosh, this is so much faster and so much better. Then, that's a good conversation to have. And then lastly, again, planning and discussing your migration with your cloud provider. Just find out if they're going to have a dedicated team that's going to be working with you to your journey to the cloud, working with a project manager, for example. Who are those people going to work with on your side of the organization to make that, to get that done, and making sure that you're scheduling enough time for testing and all those types of things. So I think those are definitely things that everybody needs to consider when they're moving to the cloud. So with that, I want to thank everybody for attending today. Gary, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Chris. Really valuable information for any of our audience members who might be considering a move to the cloud. So thank you for all that good info. I see a few questions have come through, so let's see if you can help folks with some of these responses. Chris, you gave us an overview of several models of cloud. Which is better, private cloud, Microsoft Azure, or AWS?
Well, I think that's a good question, and I'm going to kind of answer it with a word that I like. It depends, right? So each of those models, the private cloud, Azure, AWS, each have their own advantages, and it really depends on the workloads that you're hosting, what kind of licensing capabilities you have. For example, if you're a 501c3 organization, it's probably going to be cheaper for you to run in Azure than any other environment, because you can bring some of the licensing at a very low cost there. If you have a lot of storage needs there from like either backup or images or files, the AWS route might be a better option just because of the technology and storage. Again, if you're wanting more control and flexibility and customizations, the private cloud might be a little bit better. So I think it really just depends on, I wouldn't say any of them are better over the other. I would just say that the advantages are clear between the three. I think an assessment of your environment and understanding your workload and your needs kind of helps guide that decision on which one's the best fit for you.
Great, thank you. I think you touched a little bit on this toward the end of the presentation, but the question is, what are the essential factors of planning your migration to the cloud?
Well, I think first of all, again, doing an assessment is a very large thing, because oftentimes we'll find organizations that maybe have undersized or maybe even oversized some of their compute resources and things that are on premise or in another cloud. And a lot of times that, if you're migrating to the cloud, sometimes those things could, be very negative, right? If you're undersizing things, then you're going to have severe performance issues. If you're oversizing things and you're paying for way more than what you really need to, right? So having that assessment done, I think, is an essential factor of moving to the cloud. Having a project manager during the process of migrating to the cloud, and a project manager in terms of the cloud service provider, having a project manager for your team to work with to guide you through all the steps that you need to migrate to the cloud. So I think that's an essential factor. And then lastly, I think, like I'll say it, testing, right? So on average, we usually provide at least 2 to 3 weeks of testing, sometimes more depending on, the organization's needs and requirements. But, designing your migration in such a way that you can, at least test, make sure everything is working the way you need it to, and then performing your final migration. In some cases, you can't do that, but in a lot of cases, you can. So having the ability to test and making sure that your cloud experience is going to be great when you actually cut over, I think, is the key.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, how do you decide if cloud computing suits your requirements?
So again, I mean, this kind of goes back to the question goes back to the term of the assessment, right? So I think the best way to determine what which cloud computing meets your requirements is doing an assessment of your current environment. And again, talking with that cloud service provider to make sure that they understand your needs and maybe some of your problem areas that you're having within the infrastructure. Because again, if you point those things out to the cloud service provider, they can most often architect or figure out a way to provide that benefit or provide a better experience for you in that cloud environment. So I think doing an assessment, I think, is very key in that regard.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm not seeing any additional questions. For those of you listening today who have a specific question for Chris or any other member of our team, please submit it to us at info@medtechsolutions.com, and we'll try and get you an answer to your specific question. So we've come to the end of our time together. Thank you all for participating in today's webinar. If you'd like additional detail about anything you've heard from Chris today, we invite you to contact us at the address that you see on your screen, info@medtechsolutions.com. And we invite you to watch your email inbox for invitations to attend future MTS presentations. Please plan to join us again. For now, have a great day.